Corpus Act of 1679. What is habeas corpus, and to what extent, if any, is it essential to the principle of limited government? How has the writ of habeas corpus evolved in the United States? And lastly, under what circumstances, if any, might the writ of habeas corpus place an unnecessary burden on the government? You may begin when ready.
The Enlightenment of the 18th century emphasized the natural rights of Englishmen and challenged the divine right of kings. This attempt to decrease monarchical power was evident with Parliament's Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, which codified a judicial check on executive authority. Our unit believes that limited government is like an egg, and habeas corpus its shell, holding together the yolk and whites of procedural due process and preventing these essential rights from spilling out into tyranny.
Habeas corpus is a legal procedure that brings an individual before a court to allow them to challenge the legality of their detention. As William Blackstone describes in Commentaries on the Laws of England from 1765, habeas corpus ideally prevented the king from arbitrarily usurping rights. Therefore, it is essential for limited government, serving as a barrier for all other protections and as a remedy for shortfalls of governmental procedures.
Without habeas protections, unlimited governments can deprive people of due process rights. For example, the Chinese government continues to detain the weaker population, denying them due process enumerated in Article 37 of the Chinese Constitution. Unlike in the US, these constitutional rights remain unenforced without an independent judiciary empowered by legal remedies like habeas corpus.
In the United States, habeas corpus has continually evolved, at first expanding in its scope to later narrowing in response to terrorism. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution limited the federal government's ability to suspend habeas corpus to only during times of rebellion or invasion, but Section 10 does not have analogous restrictions on the states. For almost a century, state prisoners could not seek habeas relief in federal courts.
Habeas corpus was first applied through the Judiciary Act of 1789, allowing courts to issue writs to those in federal custody. This right only expanded to the states during Reconstruction, with the Habeas Corpus Act of 1867, which allowed federal courts to issue writs on behalf of state prisoners. This ability was expanded by the Supreme Court in the 1960s. However, since then, tough on crime reforms and the government's response to terrorism has eroded habeas corpus.
The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 has limited federal courts from granting habeas corpus to state prisoners and banned second and successive petitions. Similarly, the War on Terror after 9/11 led to the establishment of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp. Though cases such as Boumediene versus Bush from 2008 have upheld these detainees' rights to habeas corpus, adequate due process continues to be denied.
Our unit disagrees on when habeas corpus places an unreasonable burden on the government and thus can be suspended. I believe the government should be able to temporarily suspend habeas corpus during times of rebellion or invasion as stated in Article 1, Section 9. For example, during the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus to ensure suspected Southern sympathizers could not undermine the war effort.
On the other hand, Aubrey and I believe that the federal suspension of habeas corpus has historically never been justified. Suspending the writ before trial leaves those deprived of Fifth Amendment due process rights without a legal remedy. Seeing as habeas corpus is supposed to prevent arbitrary government, this protection is equally, if not more important, in times of rebellion or invasion to check the executive than in times of peace.
Furthermore, post-conviction writs of habeas corpus must also be protected. This type of habeas corpus may come at the expense of comity, or federal respect for state rulings and finality. However, successful post-conviction writs preserve the defendant's invaluable rights, as seen in Gideon versus Wainwright from 1963. Thus, Smriti and I believe that the eggshell of habeas corpus should not be cracked, lest procedural due process spill and limited government be nothing but an empty shell. Thank you.
All right, nicely done. I'll lead off with a question. I want to follow up a little bit and ask you to elaborate. You made this statement toward the end of your essay on how the War on Terror and other more recent efforts are eroding due process protections in your view. Can you elaborate on that as it relates to habeas? Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, specifically to the War on Terror. After 9/11, the Military Commissions Act of 2006 has established the ability to try Guantanamo Bay prisoners. And this act basically says that evidence obtained through hearsay and coercive interrogation techniques can be used. And this violates the Fifth and Sixth Amendment due process rights that are given to other people.
I would like to disagree with my roommate Smriti. I think that the Military Commissions Act of 2006 was a necessary step to protect national security from potential terrorists who might pose a threat if released, if even given the chance to be released. I think we can see this, for example, in US v. Rahman from 1994, when federal prosecutors had to prosecuted a suspected terrorist under Article 3 courts, and the prosecutor had to give the defendant the names of 300 unindicted co-conspirators as a part of federal protections for defendants. However, this information leaked to Osama bin Laden within 2 weeks. And so I think it's necessary to, I think that the Military Commissions Act does give some due process to military prisoners. It's just that I don't think we can afford Article 3 courts to suspected terrorists.
All right, thank you.
So do you find the suspension language in Article 1, Section 9 to be too vague? And do you see the potential for any abuse of that language in contemporary life?
Yes, I would agree that it is too vague, specifically, although it was enumerated in Article 1. So it's kind of been implied that it's congressional power. It's been expanded to be an executive power as seen through the Act of 1867. However, or this can be seen, for example, when President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus on a federal level in the Civil War. And I think that that was an overextension of executive power. For example, we can see, as Eric Foner writes in the Fiery Trial from 2010, that there were certain states that were left over that kind of refused to rid of this suspension following this. And so I think that at a federal level, it can be too dangerous to suspend habeas corpus, and at the executive power is an overreach.
I would like to agree with my unit mate Aubrey. I would uphold Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor's opinion in Hamdi v. Rumsfeld from 2004, where she says that a state of war does not give the president a blank check to do whatever he wants. And I believe that that utilizing the suspension clause is as if the president has a blank check. So I actually believe that the suspension of habeas corpus should only be on the local level during times of emergency, such as during a natural disaster. And this could be seen with following the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, where Mayor Eugene Schmitz temporarily declared and unofficially declared martial law and suspended habeas corpus for a few days.
But I'm thinking more about like the recent spate of protests we've had over the last year or so, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protests, and we saw some local and state jurisdictions really push that idea of what the language of the suspension clause means. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would agree that I think the suspension clause definitely is too vague. It doesn't even denote who is not allowed to suspend habeas corpus. I think that if we look at an international example like Argentina, especially in the 1970s, their military, their presidents essentially declared a state of siege, which allowed them to suspend habeas corpus. And their justification was because they suspected that communists were infiltrating the government. And obviously, that's, I think, a way too sparse a justification. And I think that if we look at the language of Article 1, Section 9, could potentially be used in the United States. So I would propose that we need to pass an amendment to clarify the language of Article 1, Section 9 to make sure that this Congress is A, given only to Congress, not the president, and B, cannot be abused due to the vague provisions that it has.
However, in response to for example, the suspension of habeas corpus with the Black Lives Matter protests, that can even be seen in New York, in which Justice James Burke suspended habeas corpus for a few days following not only the COVID pandemic, but the Black Lives Matter protests. However, I think that this was not only an overreach of, judicial power, as it's not specifically enumerated as their power, but it even violates New York's legislation, such as Roundtree versus New York from 1991 said that people couldn't be denied these habeas corpus grants for more than 24 hours, and it also violated that.
I'm curious, in your prepared remarks, there's a disagreement among you about the justification of Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. So if we think about something broader than just habeas corpus, and we think about the tension between civil liberties and the public good or public safety, what does your panel think about other instances, not just of habeas corpus, but other instances of civil rights being set aside or suspended in times of national crisis? Do any come to mind? Any instances of that come to mind, and where do you fall under justification?
I mean, I would look back again to the Civil War. I think the suspension of habeas corpus and the declaration of martial law on April 27th, 1861, in response to the Maryland legislature's threat to secede from the Union, was justified because, well, Washington, D.C. is actually surrounded in the north by Maryland and in the south by Virginia. Virginia had already seceded. And you could argue that President Lincoln, by declaring martial law in Maryland, was usurping, Maryland's right to secede. But I think that it was necessary just in order to preserve the Union as a whole, because I don't think President Abraham Lincoln would have been able to, govern the North from an enclave, essentially, in Washington, D.C., if Maryland had seceded. And so I think this is an example where the setting aside of civil liberties was definitely justified.
Another example of setting aside just like rights for the quote unquote common good can be seen with Korematsu v. U.S. from 1944, with the detention of Japanese Americans during World War II. However, I believe that this was again just the president just like using his power, as they didn't also take into account people of, for example, German origin, and it was only Japanese people.
However, in both of these cases, I think that it's not justified. I think that it would violate, for example, what John Stuart Mill writes in On Liberty from 1859, and that the common good should only be exercised and natural rights should only be exercised as long as it doesn't infringe on other people's common good. So for example, with case of Korematsu and Executive Order 9066, there were nearly 10,000 people that were arrested, and 1/3 of these people were Americans.
Perfect timing.
Yeah, perfect timing. Yeah. Excellent job.
Very nicely done by the three of you. Boy, I was impressed. As a starting point, I enjoyed the egg metaphor. Kind of that you laced through your essay. At the start, it caught my attention, and then you pulled it back around to the eggshell. So that was well done, I thought, and clever. It was really enjoyable. I mean, when we can have a conversation like you were doing with the three of us, and you do it so easily with sound citations and critical thinking and bolstering your positions by pulling in all types of ancient as well as more recent history, it's most impressive. You have a clear, broad breadth of knowledge about the topic, and I was impressed by that. You all three contributed equally and could add to one another's comments as well as disagree. And that's important to be able to. We've commented in other groups, our country would be well served to be able to do that a little better now and have a conversation and listen to the different viewpoints. So you're to be commended on all of that, but I was very impressed by your handling of it, and wish you well moving forward. And my two colleagues will jump in.
Yeah, I concur with what everything Steve said. It was a very enjoyable presentation. I just enjoyed the conversation, right? You weren't giving us a speech. You were just telling us what you think, backing it up. You were able to disagree with each other, or at least to represent that you understand that there are multiple viewpoints. These are tough questions, and there's no single right answer. And you're reflecting that understanding. And that's what we as Americans need to be able to do, is look at really tough, messy situations and try to work through it in conversation with one another. I really appreciated your international comparisons. I love that we can, we claim to be the beacon of democracy, and yet we need to be able to look around the world, and China and Argentina as your couple of examples were, I think, spot on and great examples. good use of evidence of a variety. And then the level of your research is to be commended, because not only, my Black Lives Matter question is like, yeah, you knew about the New York suspension, but then you knew which law in New York was violated. I mean, that's just like, that's what I love about this program. And that's a commendation to your coaches and your supporters. I know them all, and I know how hard you all work. So congratulations, and just the best of luck in everything you do.
I guess I have a couple things to say. And the first is that you three are super smart. And of course, we're seeing lots of smart, but you're just super smart. Your level of detail and analysis and handling. The reason that I like judging Unit 1 is these questions are messy and complicated and nuanced. And you demonstrated that even just by disagreeing with each other. I've read a ton of books on Lincoln, and each book changes my mind whether he was right with habeas. So I could totally see both sides of your of your disagreement there. I think that Korematsu has come up a couple times in Japanese internment with this question. I've been waiting for somebody to point out the obvious thing, which was it wasn't just about public safety or civil, because the Germans weren't locked up and the Italians weren't locked up, and we were at war with them too. And sometimes you got to call a spade, and it's that obvious, and you did that very well. I kept wanting to jump in and interrupt you guys and ask more questions, but we have to be an official judge, and that's what I was aiming to do. But the reason why I wanted to do that is because I was so engaged, and I knew that you would keep telling me interesting stuff. So this was just a blast for me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and a big congratulations and thanks to all your coaches and teachers. And again, very nice job.